anyone else, but I have noticed lately, when you really get into some of the newer television dramas, the ones that like go straight to streaming, that want you to like sit there and binge the whole time, especially if it's one where the episodes will all tie together into a larger story at the end of the season, or perhaps not sometimes, that those episodes, and sometimes those seasons, seem to end with cliffhangers. It's a very intentional choice by the writers. They do that to make sure that you will actually watch the next episode. It is in Netflix's best interest that you continue to sit there. Or that you will come back and look for the following season. It started to really stand out to me a few months ago when Brad and I finally got around to watching Severance. I'm not going to actually, this is not actually about Severance. No spoilers. But I will say that one, it is a great and engaging thriller, and if you haven't watched it yet, it keeps you constantly at least a little bit uncertain, I should say. It keeps you at least a little bit uncertain about what is to come next the whole time. The premise is that when you are at work, you have no idea what your personal life is like. When you are outside of work, you have no idea what you do for a living. An interesting premise, but indeed an engaging thriller. And two, it accomplishes being an engaging thriller by ending nearly every episode in some kind of cliffhanger. And both seasons, with years in between the first two seasons. Sorry for all of you who watched it the first season at the beginning, and I at least only caught on this year. These episodes are divided up in this way to create the maximum level of drama, leaving the maximum number of things unresolved to make sure that you'll keep watching. Leaves us maximally worried about what danger the characters might face next. Or it leaves us right after a catastrophe has occurred and before that catastrophe can be addressed. I find myself starting to wonder if that style of storytelling is starting to impact how we think about the stories of our own lives. As I mentioned last night, throughout this season, I wanted to think in terms of storytelling and its power over us in different ways. And so when you tell your own story, where do you place the chapter breaks or the episode breaks? Do you too put the breaks right when things are most uncertain and danger is most imminent? Right when things are perhaps at their worst? And what I mean by this is when you face a failure, a loss, a setback in your life, is that the end of the episode or is it the start of a new one? The answer to that question may actually have significant impact on your overall emotional well-being. As you may now realize from previous years' Rosh Hashana sermons, I am a frequent listener to the podcast Hidden Brain, hosted by journalist Shankar Vedantam. This podcast explores different avenues of psychological research and offers ways to think about ourselves and our world differently as we learn to understand how our own brains work. An episode that caught my attention toward the end of July this summer was entitled You 2.0, Change Your Story, Change Your Life. I have to admit, at first I scoffed at the title and almost didn't listen to the episode. Was this going to be an episode in which I'm just supposed to use more positive language? Say I get to instead of saying I have to? I know what my life is like, and I know that sometimes it's difficult, and there are a lot of things that I have to deal with. As a colleague friend of mine said recently, I never thought I'd have to defend myself as a Jew. Changing that to I never thought I'd get to defend myself as a Jew doesn't really help. We'll go into that more tomorrow. So how is reframing my wording going to change my life? But I gave the episode a chance, and it turned out not to be about changing have to get to, nor any other kind of linguistic positive spin on that which makes life hard. It did not pretend that blind positivity was the answer. Instead, the episode turned out to be an exploration of research in a field called narrative psychology, which explores how our well-being is shaped and impacted by the way we tell ourselves our own story. It isn't about about how we reframe our stories so much as how we use them for meaning making. The research shows that where we place the chapter breaks in our lives ends up having a dramatic impact on our emotional well-being and on our resilience. This research suggests that it is really about shifting the pauses in your story, not the content. It is not about pretending that setbacks aren't setbacks or things aren't quite as bad as they seem. It's really about seeing our setbacks as part of the arc of our whole story, rather than the end of a chapter in it. They don't give meaning to your life in and of themselves. They become part of the full arc in which you make living from your own life. In this episode of Hidden Brain, the host interviewed psychologist Jonathan Adler, who came to study narrative psychology by noticing how his own scaffolding of his story in his own mind impacted how he thought about life, and how that, in turn, impacted his overall well-being. He described as a college student spending a semester abroad and hoped that while away, he'd become a completely new and outgoing social butterfly of a person. But when he returned, the same relatively shy, reserved person as he'd left, and he placed a chapter break there in his internal story, and thought of himself as a shy person who'd never have any friends. That unhappiness bred further unhappiness, made it harder to break out of it, and he got into a rut thinking that things could never be different. Later, he came across the work of Dr. Dan McAdams of Northwestern University, who was starting to explore this notion of narrative psychology. He argued that the stories we tell ourselves about our lives have impact on our well-being. It has to do with how we make sense of the negative things that happen to us. And so to quote Jonathan Adler from the podcast on his own research, you can't totally control the things that happen in your life. You do have more say in how you make sense of it. And that's important to remember. We're talking about stories here. We know from research on memory that we're actually not very good at recording the objective facts of our experiences. For a long time, that frustrated cognitive scientists. But in more recent years, it's become clear that our memory works that way for a good reason. If you think about why we have memory in the first place, it's so that we can hold on to it's not so that we can hold on to every single thing that's happened to us in some clear and certain way. We have memories so that we can make sense of what's happening to us now, and so we can start to anticipate what might happen next. So if you were to walk by a cave and a bear jumps out, you don't necessarily need to remember that exact cave or that exact bear. But you do need to remember that dangerous things can hide in dark places. So the slippery, reconstructive nature of memory is a feature of the system, not a bug. And stories are an amazing tool for holding on to meaning of our past experiences. The objective facts of our lives are what they are. But the stories are about where we draw connections between things, where we parse the breaks of the chapter breaks of our own lives. Those are narrative acts, Adler says, not historical acts. And the way that we do that can have big implications for our well-being. Where we draw connections between negative and positive matters a lot. He's saying that whenever we tell ourselves a story, there's some kind of arc to it. Whether a repetition of our own memory or a story we've heard before or coming up with a new story, there's always some kind of arc to it. Things can start out great and fall apart. Or they can start in a really down place and grow from there. Adler refers to the stories that start out bad and end good as a redemptive sequence. Those that start out good and end badly, he calls a contamination sequence. Life, we acknowledge, is full of ups and downs. Our own experiences coming at us in surprises and waves all the time. But we can actually decide if our experiences are linked together in redemptive or contaminated ways, in how we think about, remember, and tell the stories of our lives. If you focus on the bad experience as the end of the chapter, the end of a relationship, a lost job, a project that didn't go right, if those experiences are the end of your chapter, their negativity is carried with you. We're more likely to become the kind of person who tells ourselves that we can't get anything right. But if those same experiences are part of a chapter, a piece we might still be living, that can later come up again, they're part of a redemptive narrative. They are part of a redemptive narrative. That relationship perhaps ended so you could better connect to yourself. Perhaps the job ended so that you could land in a better place or try something different. Perhaps the project failed in order to help you learn something about how the world works or your own projects work. Research actually showed that the folks who usually frame their experiences in redemptive arcs have an overall more positive outlook and well-being, and those who tend to frame the experiences of their lives in a more contaminated arc tend to have worse well-being. Thankfully, the research also showed that those who received therapeutic treatment to help reframe the contaminated narratives did also then see increased well-being, meaning we can actually change this for ourselves. The actual facts of the story need not be different. It's how the experience is conveyed, how it's told, and how it's internalized. We tend to think that our emotions are simply the results and reactions of every experience that we have. And yet this research suggests that what we think about our experiences also impact how we feel about them. Stories help us to make meaning and to understand the world around us. Our emotional experiences are actually shaped by the stories we tell ourselves about our experiences. Jonathan Adler shares his own experience as an example. He shared that he'd applied to 10 graduate programs following his undergraduate degree and only ended up getting into one. For Jonathan, that could have been another story of personal setback. He could have told himself a story in which he is constantly rejected, in which he is unworthy. That would have been the contamination theme, ending the chapter at receiving only 1 out of 10 graduate school acceptances. Instead, he places it in the middle and tells a story in the context of what happened next. As someone who'd always lived in the Northeast, he began to research what life might be like for a gay man in the Midwest. He reached out to someone at this new university's LGBTQ+ resource center to ask questions. He received a thoughtful and thorough letter back, and the two corresponded a bit. When it came time for him to actually move, the person he'd reached out to helped him to find his first apartment. That person later became his husband, and the two now share a house and 2 dogs. So his story of the overall experience is not one of frequent rejection and unworthiness anymore. It is now one of the universe sending him on the right path for the rest of his life. By moving the brake away from the rejections to 9 other programs and rather toward the one acceptance and what it led to, he turned the same experience into a redemptive story. So if we tell ourselves that the world is hopeless, we may find it harder to find hope. If we focus on when we only got into one school, we miss the pull of the one that brought us to the right person. I'll admit my rabbinic job search took much longer than I'd expected it to in early 2022. It was stressful and it was difficult at the time. But thank God, it landed me here with all of you. Cliffhangers are for entertainment and for drama. It is okay for a TV show to place the brake in the hardest moments, when things are most downtrodden. But we cannot think about our own lives that way. When we review the events of our lives, we have to link them together as a whole, and to shift the chapter breaks to after we have gotten through it, whatever it is. Because your life is not a TV drama. I don't think I'm living in Severance. How you see and interpret your own story matters. The Torah knows this, as did the rabbis when they set up our Torah reading cycle. When we divide our Torah into passages to be read, we never end on a negative verse. It's part of why the triennial cycle is not a simple, even divided by 3 of the full parsha into 3 equal passages, and is rather often split along one of the longer passages for a full Torah reading, split between different aliyot in different years, because we don't want to end on something negative, because the Torah is reflective of our life, and how we encounter Torah is reflective of our life, not of entertainment. But the Torah, even within a particular reading, also sets the brakes in as positive a place as possible, even when telling stories that contain immense suffering. I asked you to note, when you looked at the Torah reading this morning, especially on today's third aliyah, where the breaks would be. We saw it in how the rabbis divided that aliyah, containing the conclusion of Hagar's story in our Torah. Hagar is a maidservant in the house of Avram and Sarai, initially, later Abraham and Sarah. She's used to conceive Abraham's first child at Sarah's suggestion, but then treated poorly when she does so. She runs away, but is sent back by an angel of God. Her son is born and is given the name Ishmael, meaning God hears. In today's reading, when we return to her, now after the birth and weaning of Sarah's own son, Isaac, it is extremely unclear what it is that Hagar's son did that caused Sarah to be so upset, but Sarah cast Hagar and her son out of the house. You can take a look, if you want, back in your Machzor on page 101. Early in the morning, Abraham gathers up some bread and a water skin and gives them to Hagar. The supplies and her son are placed on her shoulders, and she's sent out. She wanders the wilderness of Beersheba, and they slowly drink through the water and each through their food. They have none left. Unable to bear the thought of witnessing her child's death, Hagar places him under a bush and goes a bow shot away before she collapses into tears and despair. A TV telling of the book of Genesis might pause the story here. If not for an episode break, at least a commercial one. Will they survive or not? But again, our Torah does not work that way. A narrative psychologist would say that to do so is to keep this a contamination narrative. That to place the mental pause in the story here is to cement despair into Hagar's and into our psyches. But the rabbis don't place the aliyah break there. They keep us going. The next verse, God hears the cry of the child, and an angel comes to Hagar. Ma lach, Hagar. How are you? What troubles you? Do not be afraid. God hears the boy's cries, and you will both get through this. Go back to him. God opens Hagar's eyes, and she sees a well. She fills the canteen with water and returns to her son and gives him the water. I assume she drinks some for herself too, but the Torah does not record this. Too focused is she on caring for her son. God is with them. The boy grows up. The aliyah really ends when she finds a wife for her son, when they have been redeemed from this particular struggle. It does not erase the pain or the severity of her experiences, but it does end on a note of hope. It tells the story in a way that there's potential for growth in the future. And while I know that she's a side character in our Torah, the one pushed out, the one our ancestors treated badly, I've always found myself drawn to Hagar in this chapter because that experience is so real. Not necessarily the specifics of her experiences, but the sense that we have all at some point faced rejection, despair, hopelessness, a feeling of being cast out. I know that there have been times when I would like to have set down that which I could not fix or save and walk away and cry and let that be the end. But her story does not end there. It is not even permitted to pause there. On years when the reading falls on Shabbat, we need to shorten the readings. The pause is after God hears the cries of the boy. Only after God hears those cries are we permitted to pause the reading. Only after the resolution and redemption at least begins does our reading take a breath. God sees distress and responds, which is what we need in order to move forward. to open Hagar's eyes to the well that will complete their redemption. The rabbis debate whether that well had been there the whole time, or if God performed a miracle and placed it there before opening Hagar's eyes. I tend to believe that it was there the whole time, and she needed the help to move through her distress to see it. That she was quite reasonably tempted to see the down moment as a defining one, the end of her chapter. And yet God asks her, and our Torah asks us, to move ever forward. God offers help and offers her strength. God stays with them for the remainder of their lives, and the Torah ends with their story when Ishmael has a wife and a career ready to move forward. It does not let her end in distress. I've been asked a lot this year about resilience. I truly believe, as I reviewed this episode of Hidden Brain, believe that it comes from recognizing how we think about our own stories. Where have you placed the pauses in your story of this year? Do you let the traumas of your life be the defining moments, telling the story that Dr. Adler called a contamination arc? I know I have sometimes tended to go there. But can we instead find the moments to move forward, even just a tiny bit? After the setback, God heard Ishmael cry. God let Hagar see that there was help. We learn where our lives were meant to have gone. Think back for a moment on your year, the moments that made it hardest, and find the ways to tell a slightly different story about it. Don't erase the pain. It is a part of your story. But how can you make it a part of your story and not the end of a chapter? Can you tell yourself a different story about your pains? Can you make those moments a part of a whole rather than a piece of a story that ended in catastrophe? I know it's been a difficult year for many of us, but I challenge us all to shift the places where we pause our stories. That, I think, is the lesson of narrative psychology. And I think the lesson reflecting on our lives in Rosh Hashana. I think we must look for the meaning that flows from the difficult moments. My setbacks were not the ends of chapters of my story, but rather opportunities for new lessons and doors opening up the new ways of living my life. Change your story, change your life. Not I get to instead of I have to, but rather where and how do I move forward. May the year ahead only hold blessings for us. And when it inevitably does not, may the setbacks in the year ahead be ones that we can frame for growth so that we can continue to see the way forward and so we continue to hold on to resilience. May we change our stories for the better. And in the end, when we rejoin here next year, may we each have new stories of our own resilience. Shana Tova. Give us a moment to allow any who are in the lobby to come in.